Dear friends, we are already moving into the final session, and it's about feedback from the small groups. Half an hour would be allotted for that, followed by the second half. In the second half, we have wrapping up the conversations. So that's our plan. And this session would be jointly moderated or chaired by three persons: Professor Felix Wilfred, Professor Paul Joshua, and Professor Julius Bautista. And I invite Professor Paul Joshua and Professor Julius Bautista to the stage.
The future dynamics of Christianity, but from the point of view of public life. There are many, about 11 issues we have discussed. The movement towards multiple religious identity is to be accelerated. These identities are not just hyphenated identities. We need to be rooted and open and take Christianity as a cultural movement located within the marginalized. This is the first thing that we got. Asian theologies have to become part of our theological curriculum. Right now, mostly the Western theologies are dominating. So Asian theologies have to migrate into our theological programs. Interflow and mutual exchange and interaction among Christianities in Asia has to be promoted. Somehow we need to destabilize religion as a primary identity. We need to promote other identities, cultural and other types of identities. Common fundamental values can become catalyzing agents for Asian Christians, and they can live their faith in a non-churchy manner amidst others. Issues around the very survival of humanity, like land, water, pure air, nuclear, biological weapons, biotechnology, neoliberal economy, has to become central to our concern. Issues of women have to become important and vital for Christianity in Asia. Life and livelihood, the church has to be present for the life and livelihood of the people of Asia. The idea of public needs to be expanded. We need to be rooted in the struggles for life. We need more integral models in theology. We might require theology of geographies, building space that does not unhome anyone. And last point, we have to use the explosive power of margins to develop public theology that is transformative and liberative.
Our group was on the future dynamics of Asian Christianity in the field of education and research. The first point was education and research, especially education, tends to be very conservative. As all of you who from education institutions know, that syllabi, curriculum, etc., especially in our Asian institutions, are very slow in changing. So if that has to capture what is happening in the field of Christianity, Asian Christianity, then they have to get rid of their conservatism and unresponsiveness. The other related question is also about methodology and pedagogy. Should these change in relation to the problematic? Second point was about diasporas. The Asian diaspora has evinced a lot of interest in what is happening in their countries of origin. And this has raised questions in their minds, and a kind of diaspora identity politics is a big factor in the growing interest in Asian Christianity. Asians in all over the world, Asian Christians. Another point which was discussed was about globalization and McDonaldization in everyday life. It's a condition that will greatly impact upon the terrain of education and research. There are broader concerns brought about by global capital and the marketplace of ideas which will affect the contours of the intellectual environment and how these are impacting social and economic systems, and also along with that resistance and struggles will have to be a subject of study. In fact, I would argue that economics should be a subject of study. And then urbanization will also change the demographic profiles of those who seek to learn. So this is a process which is going on in all Asian countries, and the notion of countries being largely rural is going to be a thing of the past. Fourth, changing dynamics regarding governmental structures will continue to be a big factor, and there should be teaching and research in this area. It was also felt that there can be a lot of learning from traditional knowledge, particularly about the environment. And this was mentioned in the case of tribal societies who had a way of life which was not so damaging to the environment as present-day economic development strategies. And they can focus on empowerment through that. Knowledge enhancement should be oriented in ways that enhance social solidarity, consensus, not just oriented towards capital accumulation. On the other hand, there's much to learn from tribal societies in terms of a more efficient and organic relationship with the environment. Another point was that the church and Christian institutions in general should be more responsive to global crises, and we all know that there are a number of global crises, both man-made and natural, which are occurring across the world, and the church has to be better prepared. Christianity has to be better prepared and oriented towards a sense of preparedness and anticipation of increasing natural calamities and global catastrophes. We need an educational paradigm that is oriented towards questions of resource management, renewal, and crisis management. Next, I think the institutional structures of Christianity are changing, or have to change, given the fluidity, diversity, and dynamism of the public sphere. And there's a breakdown of traditional social and class barriers. So what is needed is a footworking that is informed by an awareness of history and philosophical traditions. And lastly, the issue of multiple goals. Professor Heredia mentioned about multiple understandings, that when we're talking about a vision of the kingdom of heaven, I think the vision of the kingdom, we have to clearly think about it in multiple ways, and rather than the very monolithic way in which most of our theology and other things are structured. So, and this has to be reflected in both theological education as well as in other social sciences. What are the goals of which previously seemed to be much clearer, but as we understand cultures and society are tending to get much more fuzzy. Thank you very much.
Probably unlike the previous two other groups, our group is more focused on the role and nature of the church going forward in Asia. So we discussed the topic through the lens of interfaith, interreligious dialogue, and we see that the church needs to be more fluid and dynamic, no longer institutional in its outlook and behavior, its identity, so that it can take into account different things that are happening on the grounds, different ways of being, connected to Christianity, but not officially, not official belonging to the Christian church. We discussed about the phenomenon of Christ Bhaktas, for example, those people who are really in love with Jesus Christ, but they're not, interested in joining the church as a formal members. So the church going forward, in our view, has to be able to take that into account. Also, those non-practicing Christians that are not church, going, not regularly going to the church, for example, for worship, but they're very active in, doing the mission for the church. For example, in the field of social justice, struggling for the common good, and etc. Also, the phenomenon of multi-religious belonging in different Asian countries. This has been emphasized by members of our group as a phenomenon that's widespread, but Christianity doesn't have to be defensive in explaining this away. Thus, like for example, criticizing those who can be kind of fluid in their identity. They're Christians, but they're also practicing different kind of loyalties to different religious traditions without being able to theologically probably explain that. So probably that kind of practice has to be taken into account by a kind of church that is also dynamic and not fixed in that sense, not bound by institutions to a certain degree, serving again humanity in general and the common good. And I think there's also a concern about disarming the institution of the church, so to be able to really catch with the flow of the people, the dynamics of the people in Asia. We discussed a little bit about the kind of theology that might be behind this kind of being a new way of being church, the emergent church of Asia. Unbound Christ, for example, from Justin Martyr, can be helpful, but we didn't really pursue that avenue any further in our discussion. Perhaps the members of my group can complement. All right, thank you.
Reporting from Group B, also the future dynamics with regard to dialogue. And happily I noticed that the spirit of dialogue must have been between the two groups. Many of the things said by the first report I feel overlapping with ours as well. We started off with the problem of appropriation of a different tradition. The case was given of Bali. There is a kind of Balinese Hinduism, which Tagore, visiting the island, called it's Indian but not recognizable. And in a certain response and in connection with the development of this Balinese Hinduism, there is a development of an indigenous Christian Balinese, for the Balinese Christianity. In contact with the Hindu neighbors, they took over some things from the Hindu tradition with regard to clothing, liturgical dance, church architecture in the form of temples. And we realized that this problem of appropriation, something from a different tradition, you can see in Thailand, it was already mentioned in other contributions here, that when Christianity in Thailand took over with terminology and also architecture, terms from Buddhism, this was viewed with suspicion. And looking back into the history, there was a question whether what has happened between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the peoples of the book, there's a certain process of appropriation as well. That when this morning Rudy was talking about the kingdom of God to be in the center, a Jew would have said, this is our concept, you have taken it over, and Muslims would be doing something similar with regard to Judaism, Christianity. This form of appropriation, we realize, is a little bit different from the Christian going back to Hinduism, because the Hindus were talking in Bali to the Christians, you have left Hinduism, and now you are returning in some way, whereas from Judaism to Christianity and to Islam, it's a forward movement in a sense. Then was again the question Rudy took up. He mentioned in his talk that multi-religious belonging or multilingual capacity has something in common, but there is a difference if people are learning the other language, of another language, normally the people of this language would congratulate him and feel this as a positive development. When in the religious field, another religion is learning from the other and taking over, this normally is viewed with suspicion because the other group feels threatened. And also, I don't have then to go into it, we were touching on the question of belonging to Christianity. Is it only by baptism and full commitment to accept Jesus Christ and the church and the dogma that we had? The reference made was to the Christi Bhakta as well. And what is happening in the religious field, in the ideological field, there was a reference to the cultural Christians in China, where Chinese intellectuals looking for an alternative to the spoiled ideology of communist, socialist ideas in China are looking for alternative in the philosophical and theological traditions of Christianity, in a sense making use of these ideas in order to develop, or at least to look for, another form of society development in China. Then we were looking at the question of who is deciding the question of belonging and who is guiding the churches and who is in power with regard to religious questions. That the old authorities of the clergy and the establishment is challenged, and obviously an empowerment of the lay people is asked for. Our Muslim member agreed that also in Islam you have a crisis of authority, of the established authority, and he was referring that for many Muslims, turning to Google is an alternative to asking an ulema. But in general, we agreed that authority should be given more to the people. Then again, we were referring to how to develop a new way of being Christians in the basic Christian, and with regard to the interreligious field in Asia, the role of human communities. And for this, new paradigms would be needed, that in the Hindu tradition you have something that you have the freedom to choose your God, but you have not the freedom to choose caste. And with regard to Christianity, that we would need a new way of how to cooperate with other members of other faiths as well. Then we touched on what was called beyond the triple form of the triple dialogue of the FABC, the fourth, the problem of ecology. That is a question not only of respecting nature and creature, but it has to do with the human living together. A new form of community life would be asked for. We concluded by asking our Buddhist member and the Muslim member, what are your expectations with regard to Christianity? The Buddhist response was referring mostly to Japan, that it's positive what Christians are doing in the field of education and social action, but then qualifying it by saying it's positive, but still viewed with suspicion. What's the alternative? What is the motive behind it? Or is the suspicion it's a missionary intent behind it? And Islam was also saying, with regard to the Christianity in Asia, there's a suspicion there too that proselytism motive, a missionary motive, is still very strong. And there's a certain fear of the wealth of resources on the Christian side compared with the Muslims. But the main problem is that the inner Muslim problem they have within themselves with regard coping with the colonial past and especially facing the question of modernization. That was all. Thank you.
And the fourth group speaks about the pastoral and the spiritual dimension. We have 8 important points, and the first one is focus on the goal. Though the religions focus on the kingdom of God as its ultimate goal, all are not clear about this concept of kingdom of God. Of course, positively, everyone is seeking a way to fulfill the values of the kingdom of God. But what we need is the collaboration between one another at this venture of realization of this goal. Second point, let us remember that there is a conflict in multiplicity. However, as the pilgrims, we need to define the goal and the truth without monopolizing them. Everyone has to move globally towards the search of our goal in this complex world. Number 3, focus on where you are. Where am I? We need a personal question on each one's standpoint. How am I faithful to open myself to others, or am I locked in my closeness? There should be a change in the starting point from other to we or I. Number 4, prophetic witness. Our institutions and individual life should bear prophetical witness. We know we are limited persons, but we can be powerful as long as we become collaborators and associate with one another to bear witness in this confronting world. We need to know the other, talk and encourage them in humanitarian aspects. Number 5, no fear of contradiction. We need to teach the next generation to face the contradictions and confusions of the society and the world today. The dynamic is to teach the young people to live the spirit of humanity and relationship in reality. Number 6, realization of the contradictions within self. As the Asians consciously and unconsciously are caught up in the internal contradictions. Example, an Indian is influenced by the Hindu tradition and his or her ancestors' practices. So also the mixed families where a Hindu and a Christian got married, they also undergo an internal contradiction in the family life and in bringing up the children too. Number 7, as there is a gap between the life in society and in the church or religion, we need to equip the lay people to integrate them both. We need to challenge the congregation to place the spirituality in practice. Number 8 and the last, openness to the Spirit, who moves the life, and everyone has to respond to the Spirit to form a better life and individual and to form the world together. Thank you.
The last group, the pastoral and spirituality group, encouraged us not to fear contradictions, but to realize them. And clearly there have been different emphases of the various groups, perhaps even contradictions. In one group, there was the emphasis, wasn't there, of releasing our religious identity and moving to a cultural identity, but yet at the same time encouraging us to allow for a space that does not unhome anybody. So how do you encourage somebody to leave an identity which is home, yet encourage them to move to a broader identity? At the same time, we've been talking about the church as an institution, as an authority, and contradictions in that respect have also been raised about being church rather than an institutional church. And a very strange, perhaps unnovel statement was made about Google being an ecclesiastical authority. People going to Google rather than to their bishops and to their pastors and leaders. For some of us, heaven forbid, but that is the case. Google is a religious authority. So these are contradictions that we are asked to engage with, perhaps live with. I don't believe that this meeting was intended to give a conclusive answer for all the questions that we came with. Perhaps we are going away with more questions than we came. And perhaps that is the very reason why this conference was organized the way it was. Nevertheless, in trying to bring together some of these discussions, it's important for us to realize that we continue to struggle with these questions, even as we've tried to articulate some of those questions and those contradictions and the complementary nature, all being held together in this reality called life. And we as Christians, and we as other religious groups, trying to make sense of life. Before I hand it over to my fellow panelists, I'm sure you will all agree that we've learned much. We've learned much from each other. We've learned much listening to one another. And clearly, there is much to take home. There are various phrases, catchphrases that we've caught. I've caught Google as a spiritual authority that I'm going to ponder on. Very interesting statement came up earlier in the session, and this is another fascinating catchphrase that I've got, was we've obviously spoken about ISIS and terrorism from that end, but this is the first time I'm hearing of editorial terrorism. As an editor, I cringe at the fact that editorial terrorism is also possible. But at this point in time, I'd like to now invite both Dr. Julius Baptista and Professor Felix Wilfred to perhaps help us in summarize some of the findings that the groups presented to us, perhaps to give us not so much a conclusive answer, but perhaps hooks on which to hang some of the quotes that we've been trying on. So I'll allow Dr. Julius to go first and then Professor Felix Wilfred.
Dr. Joshua, you've encapsulated everything so beautifully. I think I half want to end the conference right now and such a beautiful note. But no, there are some things that I think I would like to share. Although, as you hinted at, I don't intend so much to give a conclusion, but rather perhaps an encouragement about a particular attitude that we can take from our discussions, taking into consideration all the complexities and all the contradictions that we have fathomed over the last couple of days. One of that is perhaps to think about what are the productive capacities that we all have in common that we may then channel into our own respective worlds after the conference comes to a conclusion. And when I say productive capacities, I actually would suggest that what we all have in common is that we are in positions to engage directly with people. Not necessarily through the mediation of other institutions, but I think the strength of us who are involved with Christianity is always this, the principle of dealing directly with people, which involves enhancing and fostering our own linguistic capacities. I'm sure that many of us have proficiencies in the language of the people that we have engaged with. But it's also an attitude of being able to be intersubjective with people in terms of staying with them for extended periods of time and being implicated in the struggles that they themselves go through. So my suggestion is that that's something that we all have in common. And the extent to which this gathering is to be productive, I think relies greatly on how we can think about those capacities from the themes that we've brought up. I would like to make some suggestions on how we can think about those capacities. First of all, and if I may draw from my own personal perspective, I work in an academic institution in which I am in a position to foster a pedagogical paradigm that's responsive to social, political, and even economic issues of my students. And what I draw from this gathering is the idea that perhaps I might be able to channel the principles of interfaith dialogue towards the fostering of responsible and responsive, I should say, responsive pedagogical programs. The benefits that we gain from interfaith dialogue is something I think that can be channeled into the classroom in such a way that students themselves are able to think about not just their own academic pursuits, but even their own faith commitments in ways that they have not done before. I draw this from the experience of my students, many of whom I teach a comparative religions class. And most of my students, I would say most, say that the value that they derive from a comparative religion class is in learning more about their own faiths. Not so much that they learn more about the other faith traditions. I mean, they do, but the value seems to be that it gives them a more heightened and a more acute sense of their own faith traditions, largely because there's many things that they took for granted. And my sense is that it is in the context of that interaction between different faith traditions that these kinds of insights have arisen. So the first point that I would make is perhaps we can channel, the ethic, the ethos of interfaith towards our own respective pursuits. Now, I realized, however, that channeling is premised on two assumptions. The first one I already mentioned, that we do have this capacity to engage in a direct intersubjectivity with people. But the second one is I think also very important, but to some extent somewhat unresolved, and it's something I suppose that we can take away. And that is the necessity to foster a sense of self-awareness that is no longer premised on a sense of navel-gazing, no longer premised on a notion of the alterity with which we define Asian Christianity. Perhaps it's no longer useful to be fixated on Asian Christianity as a category of demarcation, as a category of identifying identity boundaries, but focus instead on Christianity in Asia, which is a category that emphasizes situatedness rather than alterity. And it is a very subtle distinction, isn't it? Asian Christianity and Christianity in Asia. But I think that if we can take a nuanced perspective on the different implications of those two categories, then I think that we may be able to embark on some productive outcomes from our gathering over the past 2 days. And with that, I shall hand over to our maestro, Professor Felix, to give us the final word on our discussion.
It's no any solemn conclusion or any solutions to our issues we have discussed, but would like to highlight the nature of our conversations. Deliberately it was put as conversations, in the sense of, and it was really a conversation, I think, what we did. Very engaging conversation, people from different backgrounds and experiences, different disciplines, and very enriching. And this made a difference from, a lecture type, And many of our friends told that this was very, very fruitful, mutual learning. And in that sense, we can be very happy that these conversations had brought fruits. We did not have anything, definite. It's a little freewheeling. We have the book. Well, as I said, we did not want to repeat those chapters, which you can read very well, How do we build on that, further, but not in a confessional sense, as I said. Therefore, not in a sense of a mission, how the church can be better. So it's not a prescriptive. So the ending of the conference, this is not going with certain prescription. The church should do this, church should not do this, do's and don'ts. But the perspective is that of an enlightened understanding of the location of Christianity in Asia, and therefore, very correctly, as Julius pointed out, Christianity in Asia. Orthodox Church you can repeat in Chicago or New York. Syrian Christianity you can have, but Asian Christianity is not replicable. It is in situ, in context. Therefore, what we try to do is like, to use a modern thing, GPS of Asian Christianity. GPS, the location, so you know the mapping of where it is. And therefore, from that to point out, as I said before the group discussion, in an enlightened way, in a scientific way, because any science proceeds on the basis of certain data projects. So what are the possible processes and dynamics of this phenomenon of Christianity of the future? That's it, But this is not mere an intellectual exercise, because an enlightened understanding of a religious phenomenon, in this case Christianity, helps in different realms. It helps to formulation of policies in education, etc., etc. It helps in, for example, an enlightened understanding of Asian Christianity helps the church leadership how to go about today, So a studied understanding is very different from an arbitrary, where the magisterium and the teaching and authority becomes very much, I mean, this image of Google became the magisterium is very interesting to see, because in an age where it's a feudal age, is it the hierarchical, this, you think some people have special understanding and they have special authority. This all today is deconstructed, So in that sense, I think it was a GPS of Christianity in Asia, location, and we tried to see some of the major issues, which need to be deepened and further studied.